In this video, I'm going to try and cover the concepts that need to be understood in relation to how we discharge patients. That is discharge for inpatient, discharge from ED, and briefly going to cover discharging an outpatient or a day attender visit also. And so that the full documentation is collected and so that we know that the discharge summary or any detail has gone to the GP. I'm going to start first here with on the inpatient side, and to help me try and explain this, I've got the Discharge End Page open. This is to be found in the top menu here. I've got a custom list. You would generally be using a patient location list, but for this custom list, I've got 2 test patients, and I'm going to highlight the processes here that are displayed so that you know what's happened as part of that discharge journey. So we've got the patient's name, location, lead, clinician, the discharge overview, which is basically the criteria to reside. So this is based off of a power form which can be accessed from here. Here we'll show you the updates. So these are the things that will need to be done. I'm going to get to this when we cover the discharge workflow. So the discharge reconciliation, i.e. the TTOs. These 3 fields here are really the key fields to understand for the inpatient workflow. This is person completing record, it's PCR. We're going to cover that. This is the GP discharge letter signed in the record, and this is key discharge details complete. There's a power form that can be completed by anybody, but usually by nursing staff when discharging the patient. The final discharge is happening. Once all these are complete in the system, these are called events. These events switch over to green ticks. And this then automatically means that this final column, patient ready column, this is another event, is also made into a green tick. So that I'll explain that in a minute why that's important. There are other columns here which then are useful to know. So this is a column when the indication is that the AHP readiness is achieved. And here, try and ignore this for now, this discharge overdue, because we're working on this. So this is when the discharge order is placed from the discharge care plan. You have obviously the early warning score just prior to discharge, and then the safety checklist, which is done by the nursing team just prior to discharge. These are the safety things, but also including, for instance, information readiness. So this one is no, because we haven't got we haven't really finalized, we haven't given the patient the GP letter, let's say the copy of their letter. So that's when that's complete, that would go yes. So this is just an indication. When you finally discharge the patient from the ward, all of these things need to be in place. You need to have a patient ready tick, i.e. all of these things have to be done. And you need to have, it's strangely enough, it's a repetitive thing, you need to have a GP discharge letter that is signed and current. So as long as these two, this one, GDL and patient ready, are ticked, then when you discharge the patient from the ward or PAS discharge them, the GP will automatically be sent the discharge summary. Now, this is really obviously important that at the point that you do that PAS discharge by the nurse, that the nurse's final step is to go in, amend the discharge summary, revise the discharge summary, refresh it, which I'll try and show you, and then re-sign it. This is not to say they're signing, to say that they've completed it, because you've got the person completing record will still be there. But that means that the up-to-date details are captured. They print that off, finalize the discharge safety checklist to say, yes, now the patient's been given their copy. And when they discharge the patient, then the up-to-date discharge summary will go to the GP. So this is the steps for an inpatient. Let's just go into an inpatient. Now, the reason why this current patient at the bottom here doesn't have any of these details is because this patient's on an emergency encounter. I'm going to cover that just separately. So let's go into this patient, and we're going to have a look at the discharge end page. I'm not going to cover the other bits of these end pages. Very specifically about the discharge end page. So this is a workflow end page. So these are all the items on the list on the left-hand side. I've ordered these in the way that I like to have them. You can order them in any way you like. You can adjust and add and remove components that aren't particularly don't pertain to what you normally do. But you can drag and drop these to in the order that you would like. What I've also done here is to take all of my text fields which I pushed down to the bottom of the list, which seems a little bit odd, but when you then bring them into contextual view, you can now see all of my text fields to the side and all my data fields are now at the top. Okay, so all these, if I scroll down, you'll see these are all my text fields at the bottom. They're kind of out of the way of my workflow. So I've obviously got at the top of my list a problem list, This has a red asterisk because it still requires some action to complete this. So the action that needs to be taken is that we have to have a this visit problem, which is a diagnosis by definition in Cerner, and it must be, well, there's a few things it must be. So it must be a diagnosis type of discharge, and it must be from the main SNOMED CT. So these two are fixed here. The only thing that is not quite ready here is that we don't have chronic problems documented. So this is the second thing. So if there are no chronic problems, then you just document no chronic problems. Or if there are a chronic problem, then you can put asthma or whatever the chronic problem is that's not actively being treated on this visit. Okay, so I'm going to tick no chronic problems, and that will now create this green tick here. I'm going to come back to this a little bit when I talk about any diagnoses that have been added in ED. Okay, so then you just work down your list. You can look at your discharge. TTOs can be done here, different video. I'm not going to cover that now. You can review documents, because if there's anything specifically in here that you want to tag and then enter into the discharge summary, you can do at this point by opening up here, tagging the detail that you want to put in, and this adds it to the tag. And then you can tag that into the discharge summary, and this can happen with any text at all. So you can have any labs diagnostics that have text. You can add those to the record. Labs do automatically get added, so that's something you don't need to worry about. You must have the person completing record. As I said, this is one of the absolute criteria for sending the discharge summary. If this isn't completed, then the discharge summary will not be sent. Okay, so I've completed this already, and you've got my details here. You can see them. There's other fields that you can go through, okay, but the main text fields that's going to be really important to understand are these, okay. So these are over on the right hand side at the moment. So this is your shared clinical summary. All of these text fields in the discharge workflow, these are all persistent fields. Okay, so these will remain here. So you can start to add detail here if you wish at any time, and as long as nobody else comes and changes them, they will be there for the time when you're ready to create your discharge summary, which you're going to do by clicking here. This shared clinical summary is even more specific because this is the same field that is used in ED FirstNet. They have it's called something slightly different, but they basically will use that as their admission summary, detail summary. You can then use this in the admission end page. It's the same field there. It's on the manage end page. It's the same field. So you keep this up to date as the patient progresses through their journey with us. And at the final point of creating the discharge summary, it's then going to go into the discharge summary. So the best way to manage and use this field is only to use what it says, it's a summary. So only summarize things that you're going to want to go into the discharge summary. So try and keep it up to date as if you're writing the discharge summary from the beginning. Okay, so at the beginning, you may find there's extra text there if they've been through ED. You might want to modify a little bit, but then after that, you can keep adding to it as things change. So the other fields here are also persistent. A persistent field you can tell by the fact it has your name or the name of the last person that's saved that text. When you're using end pages, all of these text fields, and same for the admission, manage, and discharge end pages, any text field is used to create a note. Okay, so there's almost no point, apart from perhaps the discharge summary, and using the admission or the manage end page, putting some text in here and then just leaving it. Okay, so you need to use this to create a note, which is then part of the medical record. Okay, so once we've completed all of our workflow items here, and we've got 2 green ticks, it then will allow us to create the inpatient discharge summry. And we're going to click on this. Now, this one I've already created one before, but it doesn't matter. This is exactly what the nursing staff would do. So they will get a note already exists warning. You never need to really create a new note, but this prompt is there. You generally leave it as open existing note. Continue, then we're going to revise, never addend really in general, because that just messes up the flow of the discharge letter and summary to the GP. So revise the note. This is the whole purpose of this end page workflow. And here you can see the tag text that I used before. I'm going to just disregard it now because, well, I'm not interested in that. If you've added any new detail to the end page since you created the discharge summary, so for instance, if a MDT team member has come and added in their field, which is a persistent field also, then the nursing staff here will come in. They need to hover over this little box. It's very unclear because it's not viewable until you hover. Little swirl here. You click the refresh. It will refresh all the details from the end page, and then you can sign or re-sign the document. Okay, so this is not saying that you're the person that's responsible for this, because the person completing record is still clearly identified at the bottom here. Okay, so then you sign this. This then makes sure that the that little tab that I showed you before up here, the GDL is the GP discharge letter, that is now a green tick. So the KDD hasn't been completed yet, because this is a nursing workflow. Once they've completed their key discharge details, which is basically where the patient's going and the method of discharge, then this tick will be patient ready. Once the patient is then finally discharged after the safety checklist, that GP letter will be sent via the tie to the GP. So that's for inpatient. I'm going to, if I can, I'm going to show you the process in a launch point. Okay, so sorry, in FirstNet. So I'm now in FirstNet. You can see there with the little blue, sorry, the red sign at the top. This is not PowerChart. This is FirstNet. So this is if you are seeing sort of if you've been referred, or you're assessing, or you've taken over a patient who's still on an emergency encounter. Excuse me. So you can tell this patient's on an emergency encounter by the top right here in the banner. It says emergency. Okay, so this patient has not had a DTA. So if a patient has not had a DTA, they are still on an emergency encounter. The process for the discharge summary being sent to the GP is different. I'm sorry about that, but it just is. So here we're now on the ED discharge workflow. Okay, so it's kind of similar. There's a similar layout. You can change it as you wish, and it's all completely personal to you. So everyone can have something slightly different. But you can see here that there's different asterisks, okay, for different things. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but in general, you need to complete all four things. But the actual criteria for sending this to the GP are different. So what you need to have for a GP summary to be sent to the GP are a signed discharge summary, which is now going to be called an emergency department GP letter. Okay, so as long as you create the discharge summary from FirstNet in the ED discharge workflow, you'll have the correct one. And that has to be signed, not saved. And the second thing that you need to have done is that you have the ED discharge information power form. That's this one. This one is a requirement. So without this form being filled, then the GP discharge letter will not be sent. These other things are not required actually to send the GP discharge summary, not specifically, but obviously these are really important for data collection and for managing patient flow. So these still have to be done, but these aren't actually criteria to send the GP discharge summary. So the GP will receive this discharge summary when this patient is discharged from their ED encounter. So let's say you've seen a patient, you're on the medical team, you can come to FirstNet. We've created a specific menu item for you here called Visiting Team, and on there's just two end pages. One is the admission end page, which is actually a complete copy from PowerChart. So you can come straight here, and you can do everything that you would otherwise have done to create your admission clerking note. If you discharge a patient whilst they're still on the emergency encounter, because you haven't had to admit them, then you must use, in fact, the ED discharge workflow to create your discharge summary. I'm not going to go through that now because it's otherwise very similar in process to how we saw for the inpatient one. Okay, so if a DTA has been placed, now this is after you've assessed the patient, a registrar has assessed the patient on behalf of the consultant, or the consultant has done it, and you've said, right, this patient is it a decision to admit, then the DTA is placed. What that does is flips this entire encounter from emergency into inpatient. So it's the same physical encounter in Cernerland, but the name of it has changed. Once it's an inpatient encounter, you must use PowerChart, and you must then use the inpatient flow to create the discharge letter. I hope that's clear. The final point is that, in fact, let's go back to issues that we may have with a relationship between a patient that may have been assessed in ED and then is transferred and DTA'd. So if a patient is assessed in ED, let's say by the ED team, they will be using their ED view. And when they're adding problems, their problems are added as ED flag classification, this visit problems, and this is automatically happening. And you'll see here that it's automatically, wherever they add them, it's adding as a discharge type diagnosis. But the important point to note is that if ED add these problems, they're from the UK ED subset. And you can see here also says ED flag. Okay, so what that means is that if we were to now look at this patient from, in fact, let's go to the visiting team view. So let's say you sort of have to imagine that we're in PowerChart looking at this patient in the problem list, because it's sort of the equivalent. You can see here it appears that there's nothing documented. Now this is because the flag on that record. So if you want to see the GP, the ED diagnoses, you will click all, and now you'll see all. Now it's really, really important that you do not untick or click. All you have to do is a click, and it just removes it. Do not untick this ED flagged problems, because this will completely ruin basically the audit and the data for the CDS data that need to be submitted. Okay, for ED discharge diagnosis, which has to happen for any patient, even if they're being admitted. So please do not untick that, and so that to keep it a bit easier, just keep it to medical patient stated, and you won't even see it. So that it's much less likely that you're going to untick it. So when you add a problem here, you'll see here that you can add a problem here, and this will, if you're on the discharge end page, add it as a discharge type diagnosis, as we saw before, and it will not overwrite the ED discharge diagnosis. The benefit to this is with that ED classification, it also means that when you create the discharge summary for an inpatient after a DTA, then the ED diagnoses will not be visible on the discharge summary. Now, this used to be the case, and it caused a lot of consternation in the past, so we've now fixed that. So on the discharge summary from inpatient, you will not see any ED classification or ED flagged classification problems, which is a real improvement. But really, this is intended so that we do not delete and ruin our ECDS monitoring. Finally, I just wanted to go back, if I can, to PowerChart. Just give me a second to bring that back up again. So, and this is for our areas which are this sort of funny mix of inpatient and outpatient. So I'm thinking specifically of CAU, but here, if you have an outpatient encounter, then you'll see you can use ambulatory organizer. Okay, so this is basically the view that we're going to use for outpatients. It makes it very easy. You don't have to search for a patient using MRN. You can come in, as long as they're booked in for that day as a ward attender or whatever, and you've selected the correct what we call a resource. Well, there you go. It's typical, isn't it, that all clinicians are called resources. So here's Mr. Jethro. Here's another good resource. But I've selected iField ward, and this now will display all my patients, and I can go straight into the record from here. Now, really, really important to note here that because the patient's on an outpatient encounter, any work you do in the discharge workflow will not send to the GP currently. Okay, we're working on this because we haven't gone live with outpatients, but this will still apply for any patient on an outpatient encounter, even if they're in the hospital, almost as if they're an inpatient. Okay, so if you're discharging a patient from these areas, you must still complete that documentation, but you need to do a dictate IT the old way, the same way as we used to currently for those patients. While we work on the outpatient workflow, there will be in future a workflow very similar to everything else, which will have a discharge end page for outpatients, which will send a letter to the GP. So we're working on that, and that is coming very soon. But for now, please try and follow all those things. Keep all those things in mind. When you're pre-DTA, you must be in FirstNet. If you're after a DTA, please work in PowerCharts, and please use the workflows as they've been designed. And this will ensure that your patient's GP gets the discharge summary when they've been discharged. Thank you very much for your time.